All right, perfect. Thank you to the organizers for including the paper in the program. It's pretty good to be back here. I was here 2 years back. This is an even more beautiful setting. I think it was at a hotel a couple of years back. All right, so this is joint work with Nasser Hamdi, who's at Equifax, and Chen Fan Wu, who's a PhD student at IU. The paper, of course, is about debt relief. And debt relief is a very commonly used policy tool to help distressed borrowers, right? So think about, for example, just from the US context, think about HAMP that came out right after the Great Recession to help the mortgagers. Think of Biden's proposed plans, which were stalled by the court to help student loan borrowers, or even if you think about all the debt moratoria that was given out during the CARES Act, right? So numerous examples within the past decade, and along with that, bankruptcy protection has always been there in the background, which helps provide relief from most types of debt, right? So all the examples that I gave you were specific to a certain type of debt. Bankruptcy protection, on the other hand, is sort of a blanket protection, which is heavily used. So for example, in a typical year in the US, 1 million households seek bankruptcy protection. That amounts to about $189 billion. Right? 1 in 10 households have at some point in their lives filed for bankruptcy protection. Right? So this is, this is a tool which has existed in the background for a long time, and a substantial chunk of households rely on this tool. A big problem for any type of debt relief policy is to sort of try and understand both the potential benefits that could accrue to those who receive it and the cost to the taxpayers, right? The issue is that several of these potential benefits or even potential costs for these recipients are really hard to observe and quantify. Right, so motivated by this, we want to essentially evaluate if there are any long-term consequences of bankruptcy protection that could potentially spill over to the next generation. Right? In other words, if a parent received bankruptcy protection, are there any positive or negative outcomes on children? And we'll be focusing on 3 different outcomes. We'll look at income, we'll talk about intergenerational social mobility, and then we'll talk about home ownership. Right? So why do I say it could either be positive or negative? So it is genuinely not clear ex ante, economically speaking, which direction this will go. So let me first talk a little bit about bankruptcy protection. So the one that I'll be focusing on, so there are these 2 different chapters through which you can apply for bankruptcy protection in the US, Chapter 13 and Chapter 7, just in case somebody in the room is not aware. And so what I'll be focusing on is going to be Chapter 13, which essentially allows individuals to protect their assets and sort of reorganize debt and make a 3 to 5 year repayment plan to sort of get out of debt. Okay? And so what it helps with is you can keep all of your assets. So if you're a homeowner, you get to keep your house. If you own a car, you get to keep your car and any other assets that you might have. It improves liquidity because with that 3 to 5 year plan, you are now paying smaller amounts, and it also increases labor supply. So there is a seminal work by Bobby and Song from 2015, which shows that recipients of Chapter 13 protection, their income increases 3 to 5 years, or during the time when they are prepaying or repaying their debt. So this 3 to 5 year window. Okay. So what can happen? So one hypothesis is pretty straightforward. Well, there are these additional resources that these individuals have, and they can then invest these additional resources on development for their kids, which can lead to better human capital accumulation, leading to better outcomes for these kids. Right? On the other hand, there are 2 distinct forces that are actually going to work against this force. So for example, when there is higher access to credit and lower perceived bankruptcy costs, there are going to be lower incentives for precautionary savings, So Braxton, Harkenhoff, and Gordon Phillips have this paper where they essentially model this, where they essentially show that if credit access increases, then households rely more on credit to sort of smooth consumption during negative times. And that means that they are more likely to hit their budget constraint, which forces them to reduce long-term investments on their kids' education because they have to repay this debt, right? So in their paper, they show that higher access to credit for parents actually leads to a negative effect on children in terms of lower intergenerational mobility. There's another thing that can happen. So for example, because these parents, they increase labor supply, as was shown in Dobby and Song, they are sort of taking away some of the time away from this child rearing. So instead of spending time with their kids, now they're spending more time at work. And so this can lead to negative consequences for children's human capital development. And there's a large literature in economics that talks about this. Right? So ex ante, which of these forces would dominate is not really clear. And it's an empirical question that we want to address in this paper. Okay. So what are we going to do exactly? So we'll be looking at parents or households where parents applied for Chapter 13 protection. And then we're going to compare households amongst these who applied. Some of them are going to receive it, some of them are going to get declined, and we're going to compare those who got protection versus those who were declined. Now this could be an endogenous decision, right? Because these individuals, maybe some of these households are overambitious in terms of what kind of plans they are proposing. And so to get around an endogeneity issue, we'll be looking at, or we'll be using this random assignment of judges, and we'll use judges' propensity to approve or deny these claims. This is sort of a well-established instrument in the literature which has been used in numerous settings, both on household bankruptcy and on corporate bankruptcy. So what do we find with this setting? We find that children whose parents receive protection, they make higher income throughout their life cycle. And the magnitude is pretty strong, pretty large. So for every dollar of debt relief that is granted under Chapter 13 protection, these individuals or their children make $2 more in adjusted net present value of their lifetime earnings. The bankruptcy protection improves intergenerational mobility by about 16%. So these individuals are more likely to be in the top tercile of income when their parents were below it by about 16.7%. Home ownership by the age of 30 increases by about 26.7%. So what is driving these results? So asset protection seems to be a key, perhaps less surprisingly, seems to be a key mechanism through which this happens. Asset protection allows households to invest in children's education, allowing them to get or to acquire human capital. And along with that, this asset protection also helps households avoid disruptive geographical moves. Right? So there is literature that talks about how if a teenager is forced to move from one location to another, there could be long-term negative consequences, and avoiding these types of moves sort of helps improve outcomes for these kids as they grow up. Okay. So our paper essentially speaks to two different strands of literature. It speaks to broadly the debt relief literature and literature on bankruptcy protection. It is also related to a large literature on how parental financial characteristics affect intergenerational mobility. Okay. We make two potential contributions. We are documenting the long-run effect from bankruptcy protection on children, and specifically we are able to causally quantify this owing to this well-established instrument. And then our results essentially highlight the role that bankruptcy protection as a policy can play in improving intergenerational mobility and home ownership. Again, both things that we really care about. Okay, So this was essentially the gist of the paper. Now I'm going to get into the details, talk about the data, the exact IV that we are using, and then go through the results. So there are two parts to the data. One is bankruptcy filings for parents. This data comes from PACER. We did not collect it. This data was first used in Gross et al. 2014, and the authors were gracious enough that when we reached out, they just shared the data with us. This data includes information on judges, which is going to be important for us to get that IV for judge leniency. So judges that are going to be taking care of or that the case has been assigned to. And we also have this additional borrower characteristics like assets, liabilities, their income, expenses, and so on. The second part of our data is going to come from Equifax. This includes two different data sets within Equifax. So credit data, which is sort of like the credit line data, which we also saw, like a version of this we saw with the CCP, with the New York Fed paper this morning. What we also have is the income data, which essentially is detailed payroll data that comes from about 5,000 employers in the US. It covers about 100 million employees between the years of 2010 and 2022. Okay, so what do we do with this data, or how do we construct our sample? So we begin with, so essentially we begin with the PACER data, and then we match it with the Equifax data. The issue is that the PACER data does not have an identifier, or there's no common identifier between the two data sets that we can use to match. So essentially what we do is we match on bankruptcy filing characteristics. So we are using filing date, disposition dates, and filing zip codes. So sort of similar to the paper from Brazil that we also saw. Then we identify children within the Equifax data. Again, in the Equifax data, because it's a credit registry, it's reported as an individual, right? So I don't really see households. So this is something that we had to create. And this is how we have created households. So we have said everyone with the same last name and the exact same address belongs to the same household. So when I say address, even if it's an apartment number within the same building, we also know the apartment number, right? So everyone with the exact same last name and the exact same address, we classify them as being in the same household. And then to identify different generations, we essentially require a 17-year age gap amongst individuals. All right, just a really quick note on this. We are also able to see if somebody changes names, so we are able to see historical names. So if even after, let's say after marriage or something, if somebody changes their last name, we are able to follow their previous names, and so that sort of does not bias our matching of households here. Okay. So this procedure gives us a final sample of about 307,000 children with 263,000 parents and 201,000 unique bankruptcy cases, which we'll be using as our final sample. Okay, so what is our identification strategy? So essentially this, for those of you who have not seen this before, this is essentially judge heterogeneity in their propensity to approve or disapprove or approve or deny Chapter 13 applications. Okay. This instrument essentially relies not on differences in laws, because laws are essentially, bankruptcy laws are same or uniform across the US, or at least across the code, because we'll be looking at within the same code. But it relies on the differences in the interpretation of those laws. Okay. And so the way we construct this is essentially going to be an abnormal leniency. So when bankruptcy is filed, there are about 93 courts in the US across which bankruptcy can be filed. We are looking at within the same court. If I'm calculating the leniency measure for a judge, I'm calculating it as over and above the average leniency or the average approval rate for all other judges within that court within that year. So what is the difference between that average and the approval rate of the judge in question? So that is going to be my IV. So again, that's just the abnormal judge leniency within the same court within the same year. And of course, we use a leave one out approach, where essentially we are not considering the case in question when we are calculating these measures. All right. So it's a pretty standard two-stage least squares, where essentially judge leniency or abnormal judge leniency is our IV, that is regressed upon parental bankruptcy protection, and then the fitted values are regressed on the outcomes number of years after the bankruptcy filing. We include office by filing year fixed effects. So you can think of this office as sort of a court. In reality, every court is going to have a couple of different offices. Children's age fixed effects and parents' age fixed effects to sort of account for life cycle effects across both generations. Okay, so what are the identifying assumptions? Pretty standard. We need relevance condition, so the judge leniency needs to be associated with parents receiving the bankruptcy protection. So this is our first stage. It should be close to 1, and it is pretty close to 1. The reason it should be close to 1 is, remember, it's an abnormal measure, so abnormally or relative to any other judge, how much more likely am I to approve? So it should have been 1 to 1, and it is pretty close to 1. And if you look at the F stat, it's pretty strong. So there doesn't seem to be an issue with the first identifying assumption. The second identifying assumption, of course, is the exclusion restriction, that the judge's leniency should affect children's outcome of their parents or parents who filed only through judge's decision to either approve or disapprove. And I'm going to rely on the literature to sort of back this assumption up, because again, a large literature, I'm only citing just 4 papers here, but there are at least about 20 papers that have sort of used this type of instrument in different settings. And essentially all of them argue that judges are randomly assigned, and across courts there are different ways that are used to create this randomization. And so we just reconfirm that within our sample, and it sort of seems to go through that whatever X variable we throw in that can potentially explain judge leniency, it seems to be uncorrelated with at least all of the observables that we can observe. Right? So it sort of supports the exclusion restriction. The final assumption that we need is one of monotonicity, where essentially the idea is that the impact of this judge leniency on the probability of receiving protection should be monotonic across filers. In other words, it should not be the case that the judge is more lenient towards, let's say, younger people, but not so with the older people, right? So if they are lenient, they should be lenient across the population. If they are strict, they should be strict across the population. Yeah, please.
A question about endogenous and exogenous. So did you take consideration of the idea that the potential of one's children might be something that these judges are lenient about specifically? I feel like you did from your nod there.
No, I'm just trying to think. I did not. So
in front of the judge and I say, look, my child's going to go to Harvard. Please let me keep my assets so I can afford the fees.
Right. That is something that I did not think about, but just off the top of my head, I think it's going to be really hard for a judge to sort of think about the potential of the kid. One thing that also supports this argument is that judges interact with these households just once, like just when they are deciding whether or not to approve or disapprove the case. So it's not like they have multiple interactions to sort of judge what a potential would be. So I'm less worried about that particular person because of that reason. Yeah.
So, following up on this and also on the monotonicity assumption, there's this paper by Sasha and Darkin, co-author about racial disparities in bankruptcy in chapter 13. And there's 2 points there. I mean, they use the random assignment of trustees rather than judges. And there's a question, how does that interact with this? And then, would their result break the monotonicity assumption if you think that at least trustees are treating or being lenient differentially by race and potentially other characteristics?
Sure. So yeah, so in their paper they're just talking about like an average racial bias. They're not talking about the leniency itself varying with race, right? So that would be a problem in our setting if the leniency itself. So if it's a lenient judge, they are somehow more lenient towards let's say minorities than they are towards non-minorities, right? Then it becomes a concern. But we do directly test that. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have that in the slide right here, but we do directly test that in our setting, and that does not seem to be the case. So the monotonicity assumption, even based on race, seems to go through. So I'm just showing you a couple here. We have 4 or 5 different variables that we can potentially use in the paper, and essentially what this is showing is. So the x-axis here is high-income ACS. For example, if you look at panel A, the y-axis is low-income ACS. The different bubbles that you see essentially are the coefficient estimates of OLS regressions of leniency on either low-income or high income. And essentially, the bottom line here is that it seems that if a judge is more lenient towards high income, they also seem to be more lenient towards low income. Again, a similar thing for number of children. We've done this for race and a couple of other variables which you can find in the paper. Okay. So that leads me to the first baseline result. So what are we looking at here? So essentially, for now, let's just focus on the green dots. I'll talk about the other 2 in a minute. Each green dot essentially represents a coefficient, and then there is the confidence interval around that coefficient. The x-axis tells you the number of years after which we are capturing this estimate, right? So for example, right here, 14, the green dot right there, the outcome variable is income 14 years after the filing from parents. Okay. So what we see essentially, again, just focusing on the green dots, is that so firstly in year 10, so children of those who receive protection, they make about $1,800 more annually, and this effect seems to grow over time. Now when we talk about what does that green, red, and blue mean, so as I said earlier, with our data on the credit side, we observe data for anyone for the entire population. As long as they have some form of credit, they are going to be in our data. On the income side, we only observe about 100 million, right? So there is some selection which is driven by whether or not their employer subscribe to certain services that Equifax provides, right? So what that means is, here we are allowing children to come in and out of the sample, okay? So it is possible that they were employed in one of the employers who are covered in our income data set, let's say in year 12, but then they changed jobs and then went to a firm which is not covered in our data set, and then maybe they come back in year 18, right? So we are allowing this in and out movement from our sample, which essentially means that you could say, well, this increasing effect might just be because of a change in composition. Right, so that's the concern that we have. So to sort of keep the sample constant, we have done a few things. So a couple of things that we've done. One, we have taken the average of the 3-year window. Oh, it shows in the ceiling, but not on TV. So we've taken a 3-year average window, which essentially means if I'm looking at year 12, if an individual is in our data, let's say for 11 and 12, and not for 13, we are just taking the average. Okay? If they are in the sample even for one of those 3 years, they are going to be in the sample for year 12, right? So either they show up in year 11 or they show up in year 13, they will show up because we are taking the average income across those 3 years. So that just stabilizes the sample more. If you take a 5-year average, that stabilizes the sample even more, right? Yeah.
But people earn more as they progress with their career. So people like, how is this not just an age effect or like a tenure effect of the company?
Yeah, it could definitely be, but this is a differential effect, right? So this is the point here is that with age, the increase in income is higher for children whose parents received protection versus those who did not receive protection, right? So this is not just like a linear time age effect or life cycle. Okay. The other thing that we have done, which again I might not have on the slides, is there is a small subsample for which we can observe the entire lifespan or all the years, and even for that small subsample, when we estimate our effects, we find very similar results. All right. Coming up, so just speaking to this earlier question, what if I'm looking at income over life cycle? So I can look at the same thing. I can look at the same thing as differences in income between treated and control through their life cycle, and that is what we are doing here. So from ages 20 to 40, you will see that at age 40 or even at 38, our confidence intervals are sort of blowing up. That is just because we don't have enough data, right? So our data goes from 2010 to 2022. Okay, why does this matter? This matters because I want to get an estimate of the lifetime earnings, right? And which is what I'm going to do next. Is because ultimately, like the main goal of this exercise, at least from the income perspective, is to come up with a number by how much does income increase for every dollar of debt relief, right? So that's exactly where I'm going to next. So our goal again is to relate the amount of parental debt relief to the adjusted present value. Now here's a big challenge which was sort of unexpected for us, is the amount of debt relief that you can get in a chapter 13 protection is really, really hard to get. Like there is very little evidence out there. There are maybe 2 or 3 papers that have looked at really small samples of maybe 700 cases, 800 cases in the US. So it is really, really difficult to understand the scope of this chapter 13 protection, right? So one of the contributions of our paper again is going to be to scrape this new data, and this is something that we did ourselves, and it is more challenging than it looks. And so essentially, we downloaded these documents called final report and account, which the trustees are required to file, and these include information on the total reported debt, on the payment schedule that was approved, and at the end how much was actually paid, right? So we can see exactly step by step everything that happened from filing to the closure of the case. Okay. So the first thing that we're able to document is we have about 344,000 cases, and what we find is that the average debt relief is quite substantial. So the average debt relief is about $55,000, which is about 71% of total debt for the filers. So 71% of the debt is forgiven, which is quite substantial. We obviously did want to sort of benchmark it to whatever is out there. So we found these 2 papers. I think there's one more which we recently discovered, but all of them have less than 1,000 bankruptcy cases, and they have about 73% and close to 70% debt relief that they are documenting. So it gives us some sort of confidence that yes, what we've done is sort of checking out with whatever is out there. Okay, so this is about how much debt relief. Now I need a number for the total NPV of earnings, right? What I've shown you here is the difference at different points in time over the life cycle, but only till age 38. I'm going to omit age 40 because the confidence interval is just too large there. Okay? So how will we get to the NPV? Here we'll have to make some assumptions. And so we'll rely on the literature and make some very standard assumptions. So we'll assume a 45-year career span between age 20 and age 65. So we're assuming everybody retires at age 65. we're assuming a discount rate of 4%, and then we are calculating this NPV. So whenever we are discounting, we are calculating this at the age of 11, because an average child in our sample was 11 at the time of filing. Okay? So what do you see there? So essentially what you see there is already the discounted numbers on both red and blue lines, but they are, so from age 20 to age 38, they are the exact estimates from our identified regressions. But recall that from age 38, we don't have enough data to estimate these effects. So that's where we have to make assumptions, right? So the red line is an assumption that there is 0% growth rate. So we are not even saying that the income is going to match inflation. So there's literally 0% growth rate from age 38. That's why you see that there's a decline, right? That's just the inflation effect. Or we can assume the average growth rate between age 20 and 38, and that is the blue line. So essentially, the income is going to be somewhere in between, right? To give our estimate, we are just going to take the red line, red dots right here. So we are going to assume that after age 38, the income is going to just become stagnant. It won't even catch up with inflation. Okay? So which obviously is a very conservative assumption. Even there, we find that for $1 debt relief, there is about $2.45 higher income by just looking at those red lines. Yeah?
Why it can be below zero? Like the red line is up to zero.
Yeah. That's because we are assuming 0% growth rate, and there's 4% inflation, right? So the discount factor is 4%.
But
So
you can lose your job and, I mean, not okay.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah. So we are assuming that there is a 45-year career span. Yes. Okay. So the next couple of outcomes I'm going to just run through so that I have a little bit of time to talk about the mechanisms through which the effects are operating. Okay. So intergenerational mobility, this is defined as children ending up in top tercile of income distribution, where parents were below the top tercile of income distribution at the time of filing. So there is an actual movement within the income distribution within the same household. And we do see there's a little bit of a dip right here between years 13, 14, 15, but overall there does seem to be an effect where intergenerational mobility seems to be higher for children of recipients than those who are denied. When we look at home ownership, again a very similar effect. What is comforting to us is across the 3 different samples, we seem to be finding very similar estimates for all of our main outcomes. All right, so the last 5 minutes, I'll talk about the different mechanisms that could be driving our results. So the first thing that bankruptcy protection does is it allows you to protect your assets, right? And so clearly, if you're able to protect your house, if you are a homeowner, and if you're able to protect a house, that's going to be a big deal. So what we do essentially is we examine heterogeneity based on whether bankruptcy protection helped avoid foreclosure. Okay? So what are we doing here? Is we are comparing, so the treated group remains the same. We are looking at the exact same treated group, but for the control group, we are splitting them into those who reside in non-judicial states versus those who reside in judicial states. And the idea here is that if you reside in a non-judicial state, there are fewer restrictions to be foreclosed upon, right? So in other words, if you are denied bankruptcy protection and if you reside in a non-judicial state, then the likelihood that the lender forecloses your house is going to be much higher versus if you reside in a judicial state, right? So this is essentially giving us quasi-exogenous, quote-unquote, variation in the likelihood that you lose your house if you are denied bankruptcy protection. And what we find is that at least for income and intergenerational mobility, most of the effects seem to be coming from from non-judicial states. Home ownership is the only one which is sort of indifferent between the two. Okay? So this is consistent with the asset protection mechanism. But if I'm able to protect the assets, what do I do with it? That's one. Second, what about the renters? There could also be renters who are filing for Chapter 13 protection. Are there any effects there? So those are the two things that we'll explore next. So are children or are households able to help children accumulate more human capital? And we find results consistent with this. So we have a bunch of results. So for example, we find that parents are more likely to borrow on parent plus loans to help children with to pay their tuition. Children themselves are more likely to go to colleges. Children work in higher paying jobs, so the job selection sort of is different, which reflects the overall skill level that the children have. And also we find that there is higher education mobility over generations. So the likelihood that children end up getting a degree which is higher than their parent sort of increases. Right? So all of this consistent with the fact that there is improvement in children's education and skill development. Is asset protection helping in any of these? That does seem to be a case. So again, if I compare foreclosed versus not foreclosed, we've also done this for judicial versus non-judicial. We find that if bankruptcy protection helps avoid foreclosure, then the likelihood that the parent takes out a loan, so from columns 5 to column 8, the likelihood that a parent takes out a loan to help their kid is higher. From columns 1 to 4, the likelihood that the kid takes on the loan to go to college is also higher. Right? So it does seem to be the case that protecting that asset helps households invest in human capital development for their children. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I could see this as these families have been through a very rough period in their time. They filed for bankruptcy. Debt could be declared as bad or as good in that kid's upbringing, right? So I could see this as, the kids of parents who were granted bankruptcy just see it, oh, debt is not so bad. If I get in trouble, I can go to the judge, they're going to help me. And the kids who were raised in a family that was not granted bankruptcy, they had it very rough because of debt. So, sure, it is more investment in human capital, but it is through the use of debt. Can we call this a separate mechanism in which bankruptcy protection helps lower debt aversion, optimal debt aversion, and helps people use credit to pursue better endeavors?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You're spot on. Because so one limitation that we have is we don't observe the direct investment, right? So I cannot see if they are paying like some X dollars out of their savings. I can only see if they are doing it through credit. So that can definitely be a mechanism, but I don't think I can disentangle the two. But we can talk more. I don't think you're convinced. All right. So the last couple of mechanisms that we've looked at is, well, does it help children avoid, or does it help parents avoid forced relocations that can have negative effect on their children, especially if these children are teenagers, and that does seem to be the case. So again, if we compare this to the control group who moves shortly after denial, which we are proxying as forced mobility, we find stronger results. So that there does seem to be the case that 3 of these mechanisms sort of are contributing to the effects. We have looked at a couple more. Just in the last 1 minute, I'll just talk about these 2. So there could be some neighborhood effects. Maybe the forced moves were, so think of like ratchetty stuff where your future income and your future outcomes are heavily dependent on the areas that you grow in. And so maybe what might be happening is, if it's a forced move, then maybe these individuals, or their parents at least, are moving to worse neighborhoods, and these children are growing up in worse neighborhoods, and these neighborhood effects are essentially driving the results. But we don't seem to be finding any difference. So when we compare the neighborhoods that these children are growing up post-bankruptcy filing, they seem to be very similar, at least in terms of zip code income and school district graduation rate. Okay? One final thing that we have looked at is experience effects, which was similar to the earlier question that Sergey was talking about. Maybe this is about risk aversion. So maybe these individuals, as they go through this experience, those who are approved, or those who are denied, their risk aversion is affected, and they are more risk averse, and maybe they are more likely to take on, or less likely to take on riskier jobs, because of which their income is different, but we don't find any evidence in support of this. Alright, so I'm just going to conclude. I'm going to skip this robustness slide. So essentially what we find is that $1 of debt relief granted to parents leads to about $2 higher adjusted present value, and our results sort of highlight the role that bankruptcy protection as a policy tool can play in improving intergenerational mobility and ownership. And I look forward to Stephen's comments. Thank you.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to discuss this.
We have your slides.
Yeah, well, they'll come up. I can start talking, right? I know what I'm about to say, right? Okay, so I thought this was a really cool paper. One thing I could be doing here is like quibbling with small things about this paper. Like, there was an NPV calculation. We could talk about the way that was done, but I think at the end of the day, like, those things are basically quibbles, and this paper is fundamentally very clean, and that cleanness comes about because a whole bunch of other papers have found that this judge randomization is quasi-random. And so at the end of the day, I think we've got a really clean experiment, which estimates a really clear parameter, and again, whether it's 2 or 2.4 or 3 or whatever, clearly shows that we have a substantial effect here. So I think in the spirit of that, I want to talk about why papers are great. And I think there are 2 ways you get a great paper. One is you open the literature, and the other is you close it. And I think this opens the literature, and so I want to use this opportunity to talk about what the implications are of this and what questions this paper creates that we now need to start. What I want to say about this is there's a way we can think about this as an ex post result. Don't think of this paper as saying, imagine bankruptcy were more generous, or we approved it more often, or we didn't. Because what's happening is these are people who live their lives, they rack up debt, they have income experiences, things go wrong, then they apply for bankruptcy, and then they get a lottery draw. They get a good judge or a bad judge, a nice judge or a mean judge. And so that provides really clean exogenous variation in the deal they get ex post. And here I'm using ex ante and ex post a little differently than he did. When I say ex post, I mean after they come to the bankruptcy judge, they either get a lottery drop of acceptance or no lottery win. And that allows you to really cleanly identify the ex post benefit of getting money dropped on you in the state of the world when you've applied for bankruptcy. And we've shown that a money drop in that environment is extremely valuable. And that opens the door to the possibility that maybe we should have a more generous bankruptcy system more broadly, or more broadly, maybe we should think about doing money drops on families, particularly at particularly tough times. So that could be more generous bankruptcy systems when you have dependents. It could be more generous unemployment insurance when you have dependents. You can imagine a dependent-based form of generosity, which this paper shows that there are benefits to providing those cash drops that might motivate that. But if you want to think about that as a policy, you need to weigh that against potential costs, the ex ante effects. So ex post, we know that if we do these money drops, it makes somebody's life better. But if we did them systematically, there would be costs. So I want to interpret this through the lens of bankruptcy as insurance, thinking about trading off the ex ante and ex post benefits of this. And by ex post, I mean we do a money drop at the time you've applied to bankruptcy. Ex ante, I mean we're going to be charging these folks more money for their debt because we know they might get it forgiven in bankruptcy. It means ex ante, knowing that they're going to get a better deal in bankruptcy. Maybe people are going to make riskier decisions, riskier investments. Maybe they're going to overborrow. They're going to, engage in more committed consumption. They may do more different stuff in anticipation that they're going to get a good deal. And what this paper does is it says to us, well, we know that there are these big ex post benefits of these cash drops on families with dependents when they're having a rough time. We then need to think about trying to estimate all the other costs and benefits ex ante that we're going to trade off against that. So let's talk about bankruptcy as insurance. Bankruptcy is a money drop in the bad bankruptcy state. You don't have to repay borrowed money, or you repay less of it in bankruptcy in the case of Chapter 13. And so that allows you to consume more in the state of the world where you get the bankruptcy relief. So think of bankruptcy as an insurance payment equal to the amount of debt forgiven by the bankruptcy in net present value. But bankruptcy protection isn't free. It shows up in the form of higher rates for credit when you go to borrow, or maybe you're unable to get credit because they're worried it'll get forgiven. So like all other insurance products, bankruptcy means you're giving up money in the good state where you don't default because you have to pay back at higher rates. To get money in the bad state, money is forgiven in the case of bankruptcy. So the study design by construction, which I think is a strength, is it's ignoring that trade-off and it's focusing just on the benefits, which is not a criticism of the paper. It's just saying he's clearly identified one important component of this trade-off, and now we can think about how it fits into this broader picture. It's important to remember bankruptcy insurance needs to provide more than its actuarial value because there are ex post non-pecuniary costs of bankruptcy, shame, lack of access to future credit, whatever, and there are ex ante moral hazard costs because you might overborrow or overfile for bankruptcy. Okay, so what we've got here is this intergenerational benefit of bankruptcy as insurance, and we're transferring wealth from good states by paying higher interest to bad when things are forgiven. And what we're saying here is that money could be worth more or could be particularly useful in these bad states. So the question we want to be asking is, what's happening with families at the time they're declaring bankruptcy where money is particularly useful in those states? What is that money allowing you to do? Because what this money drop is doing really is transferring wealth from states of the world where families aren't in distress to states of the world where this distress is happening. So what this paper does then is look at the lifetime benefit for kids, and we want to think about what mechanically is happening. We heard at the end of the paper about some of the mechanisms. Okay, so I brought a prop. This is a book by Elizabeth Warren, currently a US Senator, but 20 years ago when I was a rookie professor, she was a professor at Harvard Law School, an expert on bankruptcy law, and used it as a lens to talk about household finance. She was the first seminar I brought out to Wharton when I ran the seminar series, and she presented about this book, and it changed my life. I'm interested in this stuff because of her. Her premise, and you can read, this is from a Salon article that summarized this, which is that the effort to keep kids in good school districts when one parent is laid off is likely to drive Americans into bankruptcy. More children live through their parents' bankruptcy than their parents' divorce. Parents increasingly have a lot of fixed expenses, car payments, mortgages, stuff like that are difficult or costly to adjust. So if we're talking Raj Chetty, let's say consumption commitments. And outside of bankruptcy, shocks blow up the life of your family because so many of your expenses are locked in. At other times in your life, you can move, you can switch roommates, you can, take the bus to school or the bus to work, but there's something about having a family where you have a lot of locked-in expenses where the adjustments could be particularly costly. So the idea here is shocks faced by families are particularly vulnerable to shocks because they have a lot of fixed expenses, and they interfere with, for example, children's educational investments because there are these big consumption commitments. So to adjust consumption, you have to blow up the kid's life. So basically, stability is super important for kids. Think Melissa Carney, Two-Parent Privilege, the recent book that came out, those sorts of arguments. So what this means is it provides a sort of a rationale for why we might expect a particular value to risk protection to families that's not present in other settings. Okay, so what I want to ask then is a couple questions. One is, can we compare this to other forms of intervention that support needy families? An unemployment insurance drop when you have dependents, food stamps programs, and so on. Does this have a higher return than some others? We've got a lot of other papers that estimate those. This question about varying and how discerning judges are came up earlier in the question, so I'll skip that. What I want to say is, I think this opens up a giant research opportunity to think about comparing the costs and benefits of doing what judges do randomly in this paper as policy. Would a systematic proposal to have more generous treatment of families in bankruptcy, or unemployment for that matter, with unemployment insurance, would that allow parents to make high return but risky decisions, like maybe parents aren't going to become entrepreneurs because they're worried about these risks, but maybe we want to encourage them to do that if they have good ideas? Could parents be over-investing in committed consumption? Maybe if we have too generous of a bankruptcy regime, parents are going to buy houses when they should rent houses, for example. They're going to buy nicer cars with big car payments instead of cheaper ones. Could we see overconsumption in general by parents as a response to a more generous policy? We have a fair bit of evidence on moral hazard in bankruptcy, but not really focused on families particularly. And this, I think, shows us that we need to be thinking about this, because we have a whole bunch of other policies where we treat folks with dependents differently in policy. Our tax code, food stamps, health insurance, and there's no reason in principle you couldn't say unemployment insurance benefits scale with number of dependents. Bankruptcy allowances scale with number of dependents. But is that a good policy or not? We know the benefits of that policy now, but we need to weigh them against the costs. Okay, so I thought this was a great paper. I thought it was clean. I thought it convinced me of an important fact, and I think it lays the groundwork for a lot of other people who do important work to make us decide if we want to turn this into a broader policy or not. So thanks for opening this up for all of us.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Great discussion. I think I'll add a paragraph about that this is just ex post, the way you're talking about ex post.
Yeah.
And this is in no way saying that we should increase bankruptcy protection. Yeah. But great suggestions. Thanks. Yeah.
Two comments. One kind of linked to what Steven said. So I think that, like, given the results that you have, I mean, like, in a way we know what the result. There's papers that show the result of debt relief in individuals, so like Dolly and Song, increased wages, earnings, decreased mortality, and so on and so forth. You know, that we have some research that show the effect on, like, parents on kids' education. So you could try to, like, benchmark your magnitudes of your effect to kind of like a comparison of those results to try to get to a way of getting to that comparison. And the other thing is that if I remember correctly, like the Dobie paper showed that, I mean, the result, I mean, this is like in a way a comparison between two groups. And most of the effects on mortality and all that came from people that kind of didn't receive the relief. So in a way, like, it may be interesting to see your pictures, not just as the kind of the different effect, but kind of like the dynamics of both groups, to kind of like see where that's coming from.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. So we have done a little bit of the second. We haven't done any of the benchmarking. By the way, I'm just writing your notes. I'm not texting you. So we have done a little bit about like whether this is coming from the control group or the treated group. And in our setting, it seems to be all coming from the treated group, which is sort of surprising and different from Dobie's paper. And I think my take on that is, so Dobie's paper is looking at 3 to 5 year window until which the payment goes on. And I think if you extend the income beyond that, the income effect would sort of start fading. I personally don't have the data to check that because the filings happen, like in our setting, the filing happens like before 2010 and our income data begins in 2010. So I cannot like test that, but that's my conjecture. Yeah.
Yeah, so I know in your test you use like children age fixed effects. Something I'd actually be really interested in is heterogeneity according to how old the child was at the time. I think there's two things that you get out of that. One is there's a lot of like discussion about like how well the child remembers the proceedings, and this I think would help you understand that. And then the other is it could teach you something about like what are the types of investments the parent needs to make in the time after. Like, is it at a time where they're investing in childcare? Is it a time where soon they're going to have to invest in higher education? Those sort of things.
Yeah, excellent. So we have done that, and so firstly, all like everybody in our sample is those like children are below 18. If you look at the median, it's about 12 and a half, and most of the effects are coming from when the children are between 12 and a half and 18. So when they are teenagers. And it's consistent with two things. It's consistent with what you said in your second comment, that maybe it's about like investing in children's like college, which does seem to be happening through Parent Plus loans. It is also consistent with this forced mobility story. So if you look at like Raj Chetty's paper on like this movement in neighborhoods, all the effects seem to come from teenage years and not from when the kids were younger than that. Did I see a hand here? Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question about like how much of this effect relies on the low interest rate environment. So like, you know, the typical like the moral hazard, and then there's some firms have like high risk, and also they have very weak accounting fundamentals. They're economically unavailable, but they have a chance to stay in the market because of this protection. And when the things are going well, everybody's happy and things are fine, but there's also a source of fragility. And you know, in the low interest environment, they can easily get access to credit, but if the interest rate hits, and then it's gonna influence their fragility in terms of firm performance, also gonna influence their kids, their children. So I just wonder if you see like a time series like difference in terms of like you're at the beginning of your sample or like at the end of your sample. Yeah.
So you're thinking about the interest rate environment at the time of filing, like when their parents were filing for bankruptcy.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
That is something that we have not given a lot of thought. It's okay. I see. So it's not an endogeneity concern. It's more about like, can we look at heterogeneity and see if that has a bite. Yeah, sure. That is something. Yeah, absolutely.
This is called vintage effects in mortgages. So the vintages of mortgages, and say during subprime, there was a lot of subprime lending available, and it dried up. So there's cohorts of like it's the year and subject of the mortgage, and there's different vintages with different quality.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I think you mentioned it, but I wondered, do you know what percentage of the time the judges in general like grant the bankruptcy protection versus they deny it?
So that's a question that I should know the answer to, but I don't remember off the top of my head. It's in the paper, but I just don't remember the mean leniency. Yeah, I don't know the answer. I guess. Sorry about that. Yeah.
And just to link it to current policy, in Australia, the government is moving from evaluating the effect of subsidies from 5 years to lifetime. So a lot of our actuarial graduates are now working in government, helping them to measure the lifetime effects of policies on, say, helping families with children with autism and so on. So is there a similar trend in the US to evaluate lifetime effects and a cost benefit analysis over lifetime instead of a shorter period? So does this paper link to a similar trend in the US? Or is it?
Sure. I mean, I don't know if if you just think about like how Stephen was talking about like different policies of like unemployment insurance, then people have looked at like long-term effects of unemployment insurance. Definitely in the academic setting, but I don't know if that's also happening in the policy setting or not.
Yeah, so because academics sure we look at lifetime effects of kids, but it's also starting to happen in the policies.
Right,
At least
right.
in my country.
Sure, yeah. I don't have like any specific examples that I can state that where it is also happening in the US.
So can you, maybe I missed this in the position, can you clarify how you link parents and children? and are they reason to wear what selection? Yeah, how do you make it?
Sure, yeah. So essentially, everyone who shares the same last name and the exact same address, so like up to the point of the apartment, they are all linked together as being in the same household. And then parents and children, like to split the household in generations, we have a 17-year gap.
Is it the same address before or after bankruptcy?
At some point, because we see address histories, so even though the data begins in 2010, I can see addresses going back to 1990. So at some point, the kids show up in the data when they actually get credit. So let's say if somebody gets credit at the age of 19 or at the age of 18, if I were only seeing the concurrent addresses, then that would be a problem. But I am able to see like the history of addresses. So I can tie like, okay, at some point in their lifetime, they share the exact same
I
apartment.
guess the worry about selection could be if your bankruptcy case is not approved, then your kids go live with your brother or the grandparents, and so they won't share the same address. You have differential selection on whether parents and children live together. That's different inclusion in the sample. So just showing some balance checks, like based on your instrument, do people have the same number of children, the same distribution of children?
Yeah.
That would only give you like, you have the same linkage success rate on both.
Right.
Default.
But again, our linkage is, even if they lived together, let's say in 1995, and then they filed for bankruptcy in 2001, we would still be able to classify them as in the same household.
But how do you know the address of every child who's like 5?
Yeah, exactly. So I see
So
the
exactly.
historical addresses, any historical addresses that any individual reports for their lifetime, I'm able to
But
see
that
that.
comes from where?
So they are reporting it in their credit application.
But if I'm 18, sorry, we can continue up.
Okay.
If I'm 18 and I
Yes.
apply, I'm not going to say where I lived when I was 5, right?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
So you don't, and so if my parent files for bankruptcy when I was 10, you don't know where I used to live at 10. After 10, I go to live with my grandparents because my house was
Of
foreclosed,
course,
so you
yeah,
will
yeah.
never know that
Right. So these are individuals who applied for credit at some point when they were living with their parents. If they never applied for credit and they moved out, then I would not be able to capture them. Yes.
So just to add, like when I apply for a credit card here, they do ask me what is your current address and how
And the
long have you lived
previous.
there.
Yeah.
So the first time I got a credit card when I was 18, I was living at home. So I put, this is my address and I've lived here for the last 18 years. So I guess that's how you're picking up, even when they're very young, where they live.
That is true. Yeah. That's a much better answer. Thanks.
That's
Interesting discussion. We have coffee and
Thank you.
cookies outside. Thanks.